Thank you, and good evening all those who are joining us here, as well as those on the internet. As Marina said, this session of classes will be about a very interesting book, which is called The Voice of the Silence. This book, although it bears the name of Madame Blavatsky, is not of her authorship. It is actually a translation that she did from an ancient book. Some people, she wrote it 2 years before she died in 1889, while she was resting, taking a break from her activities in France, in Fontainebleau. And there are some witnesses that tells us how Blavatsky wrote this book. And they say that Blavatsky wrote the book in a couple of days, as if she knew the book by heart. It's not that she developed the book, she just sat down and started writing, and she asked for some help with a few words in English because she was Russian, so she asked if the English was good, and these people say that it was a beautiful English in a kind of poem way of writing. And Blavatsky actually said that she knew by heart the book that she wrote. She said that this book is divided in 3 chapters, which Blavatsky calls fragments, because she says that these are fragments taken from a book that is called the Book of the Golden Precepts. She says that this Book of the Golden Precepts is a collection of treatises, of about 90 treatises, of which she learned by heart 39. And she translated 3 of them into this book. This book, the Book of the Golden Precepts, according to Blavatsky, it's not a public book. It's not a book that is known for most people or for the scholars. She says that it is a private book that is, or at least at that time, was used in some monasteries in Nepal and Tibet for the instructions of the pupils of the monks that were in charge of that monastery. The tradition that this book follows is the Buddhist tradition, although Blavatsky says some of the treatises are pre-Buddhist. You know, they were written before the Buddha, because this comes along with the idea that Theosophy says there is an ancient wisdom in humanity, and it expresses through different religions in different language, but this ancient wisdom is, or aspects of this ancient wisdom is shared by all different traditions. So there are some books that may be talking about Christianity or Buddhism, or what we call now Christianity or Buddhism or any other religion, but that were written before Jesus was born or Buddha was born. So Blavatsky says this book of the Golden Precepts belongs to a school, a Mahayana school of Buddhism, which is called Yogacara. Buddhism has several schools. In northern India, there were 2 main schools of Mahayana Buddhism. One is this one, Yogacara. The other one is called Madhyamaka. The founder of the Yogacara tradition is Arya Sangha, and the founder of the Madhyamaka school or tradition is Nagarjuna. Sometimes these 2 schools are seen as rivals, but many scholars, and Blavatsky also was agreeing with these scholars, many scholars said that they were not really rivals. At the time of Arya Sangha didn't want to oppose to what Nagarjuna had said. But later on, the disciples began to, argue against one with the other. And they argue in a very important subject, which is very, even up to date, is unresolved within Buddhism. We are going to talk a little about that. But the question is that this book of the Golden Precepts seems to have some of the reproduction of some of the discourses that Arya Sangha gave. And Blavatsky, when she was spending some years in her training in Nepal and Tibet with what had become her teachers, she learned this philosophy, and also she got her spiritual training in that particular tradition. There are some scholars, when Blavatsky published this, there was very, very little information about the Tibet and this kind of Buddhism. The Buddhism that was known at that time mainly was the Theravada tradition, which is sometimes is called Hinayana Buddhism. And the Theravada tradition differs from the Mahayana tradition to which this school belongs in some important aspects. So when Blavatsky published this book, the scholars of the time were saying that this couldn't possibly be a Buddhist book because it was talking about things that were rejected by the Theravada tradition. Now, with the knowledge of Tibetan Buddhism, as China invaded Tibet and Tibetan Buddhists came to the West, with the knowledge of this tradition, we discover more and more points that agree with Blavatsky's view about the Tibetan Buddhism. And in fact, both the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama, which are the two main authorities in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, they both endorsed this book as being a Buddhist book. This is important only because some scholars try to discredit Blavatsky by saying she never was in Tibet or she never met any Tibetan instructor, and she made everything up. But as I said, the two main lamas, the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama, they both said that this was a Buddhist teaching when these kind of teachings were not available in the West. So one of the main I think problems with the voice of the silence from a Buddhist point of view is that the voice of the silence talks about a self, an absolute self, not a relative self, not a personal self. But one of the main teachings in Theravada Buddhism is that there is no self. Anywhere in the human being can we find the real self. This is the doctrine of anatta, or atman. Atman means self. But actually, this school of Yogacara, they talk about a concept that is called alaya vijnana. Alaya vijnana is like a pure consciousness, which later developed in what in Sanskrit is called the Tathagata Garbha. Tathagata Garbha means the Buddha nature. And this Buddha nature is actually something that, although there is a lot of argument about this, and Buddhists don't like to recognize that they may be talking about a permanent nature because traditionally they say that they reject it. But this Buddha nature is in many ways similar to the concept of Atman in Vedanta. As I said, there are scholars that say that that's not true, and there are scholars that say that it is. But if you actually see the description of Atman, which is a real self in Vedanta, and the description of Tathagata Garbha, they are very similar. So the point is that this is another internal evidence that Blavatsky was actually using some text from the Yogacara tradition, because the Yogacara tradition allows this idea of a real self. I'm not going to go right now into what kind of self this real self is. It's not a self as we know it. That's why most Buddhists, they say, you could say that this is a non-self. It has nothing to do with your idea of self. So why would you call it self? Yeah, that's a position that we can take. But regardless of those philosophical subtleties, this is an important evidence, as I said, that the text that Blavatsky is talking about can be original. But since Blavatsky says this is a secret book, this is not a book that everybody can access to, scholars cannot accept that, because any person could say, yeah, I know a secret book that I cannot show you, that nobody, from the scholar point of view, they cannot accept that. But we don't care. I mean, from a spiritual point of view, we don't need to be, or to have something sanctioned by the scholar world. In their world, there are certain rules that they have to follow. But when you read books like The Voice of the Silence, what matters is what kind of teachings you have there. So this would be more or less a historical background and a little about the philosophical background. This Yogacara tradition, which now is not active in the same way as the Madhyamaka tradition, they were the Buddhism that was in India, but in time Buddhism was like expelled from India by the Hindus, and it went to Tibet, to Bhutan, China, Japan, Sri Lanka, all around India. But these two schools probably disappeared, or there are a few remnants, but they were very influential in what is today Tibetan Buddhism and also in Zen Buddhism. This Yogacara school had a heavy emphasis on meditation, much as Tibetan Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. And you can see that in The Voice of the Silence. The Voice of the Silence, as I said, has 3 fragments. These are three treatises out of these 90 treatises that were part of the Book of the Golden Precepts. There is not really a continuity between one fragment and the other, because they are separate and they talk more or less about the same, but from different aspects. In the narrative, we could see certain continuity, but not really in the development of the teachings. So they are pretty much independent. And the first treatise talks about basically the path of meditation, how the practice of meditation can lead you to the realization of truth. So that's the first fragment. This would not be very different from the Hindu teaching on meditation. But one difference that is marked in the Mahayana tradition within Buddhism is the idea of the bodhisattva. The bodhisattva is a person that reaches enlightenment, but instead of merging in nirvana or freeing himself or herself from samsara, from the illusion, instead of entering into an eternal state of bliss, they give up that perfect state of spiritual consciousness, which would put them beyond the possibility of being in touch with human beings. So they give up that state and they remain with the body, with all the conditioning that that implies, and they remain being reborn in a body so that they can help other human beings in their evolution by many ways. One of the most famous is by becoming a spiritual teacher. So the second fragment talks about this aspect. The person that was a teacher of this aspirant that now reached enlightenment ask him or her, so what are you going to do now that you are enlightened? Are you going to just go into liberation, or are you going to stay and try to help people? So the whole fragment is about these two paths that an enlightened being faces once he or she reached enlightenment. So the path of liberation or the path of renunciation of that liberation. So that's the main theme in the second fragment. And the third fragment, it's about a concept that is very theosophical. I don't think even in Tibetan Buddhism it's taught so openly as it is taught in the Theosophical view, which is a path of initiations. Not only an initiation when a guru is accepting a disciple, or a lama is accepting a disciple, or giving some mantra, or not that kind of initiation, but initiation in a more fundamental way, as a process where the consciousness of the disciple is expanded, and that disciple sees the world from a higher point of view, from a higher state of consciousness, which is not natural in the disciple. It's something that in some way the master is producing in the disciple kind of artificially. Then but the disciple comes back to his own state of consciousness and then has to work towards solidifying, so to say, that state, making that state that was, just for a moment, making it part of himself. Now he saw how life is perceived from the point of view of unity, for example. Then he comes back to his state of consciousness, and now he has to work to make that state of consciousness a reality, part of himself. So there are different stages of expansion of consciousness in this way, which are called initiations, and which are also very private. There is no guru that will come and give and offer initiations to people, all that, as many do in the West. This kind of initiation is of an occult nature, esoteric nature, if we want to call it that way. And we are going to talk about that in the third, when dealing with the third fragment. But that's more or less the main theme of the third fragment, the different virtues that the person has to acquire in order to be able to experience these initiations. So that's more or less a general outline of the book. Blavatsky says that she translated only 3 fragments because it would be useless to translate more of them. She says that to translate the rest, I should have to resort to many notes that I gathered during my studies. And she says then, and they could not be given to a world too selfish and too much attached to the objects of sense to be in any way prepared to receive such exalted ethics in the right spirit. For unless a man perseveres seriously in the pursuit of self-knowledge, he will never lend a willing ear to advice of this nature. So she says the morality that is in these precepts is too high for most people, especially in the West. You know, in the West we are taught since we are children to try to be better than the others. In school, in sports, everywhere. We are taught to fight against life to get whatever we want. We are taught to take advantage of everything, the environment, our family, friends, in grosser or subtler ways. But there are a series of attitudes which are the complete opposite to what, according to Theosophy, is necessary to really produce a fundamental change in our consciousness. So before we can do that, we need to undo many things that our culture and education did on our consciousness. This is why, and most people are not really willing to do that. They don't see the need. They don't see the need why we should transcend our needs. Why is that necessary? Many people take it as if it were just a religious duty, like there is a God that for some reason wants us to be good, and we have to be good just to please this God. But from a theosophical point of view, to be good is a need if you want to discover truth. Not because somebody is telling you you should be good. But, for example, when you are in a state of anger, it's very difficult to understand what love is. If you want to understand what love is, you have to be in that state. So if somebody would like to understand what love is, you would say, okay, you don't have to be angry. Otherwise, you won't be able to feel love. So if this person doesn't understand, that person will think that, well, it's a whim that you have. You are telling him you have to not to be angry, and then I will grant you the possibility of feeling love. But if the person understands the processes of consciousness, can see that it's a need, that it's something that you cannot escape. If you want to feel love, you cannot be angry. Just to put an example. So the spiritual rules are not rules that are imposed with a moral view, or with a religious view. They are scientifically, if we want to say it that way, scientifically proved or required. So Blavatsky, when before she begins the book, she says, dedicated to the few. So what does it mean, dedicated to the few? This is not a slogan so that the masses read the book and they think that they are part of the few. When she says dedicated to the few, it means that this book is not going to be sold as books like The Secret is sold, for example. Or, The Secret tells you how you can get whatever you want. And of course, people want to get whatever they want. And they will buy a book that says, I will tell you how to get whatever you want. So that will become a bestseller. But books like The Voice of the Silence or the books of any serious tradition, they don't say that. If you see in Christianity, the idea in Christianity is that the path is narrow. In one of the things that every mystic is talking about is that you have to bear the cross, as Jesus said. And we are going to see why these sayings, there is a deep truth in this. We are going to talk about that probably when dealing with the third fragment. But my point here is that the spiritual path is not advertised as a very easy and pinky path in any tradition. In Hinduism, they call it the razor edge path. It is as thin as a razor edge. Or in any school, any real school of spirituality. In the New Age, which is a Western take on spirituality in a vague way, the idea is to promise spirituality, attached with all kind of, or like a way to fulfill all your desires and dreams. And I guess that could be useful for people at a certain stage. It could be an incentive to follow the spiritual path. But if they are earnest, they see that things are different from that particular view. Anyway, the idea is that this book is dedicated to the few because there are not so many people that are willing to follow a real spiritual life. Not that it is something, for example, if you have there is a teenager in your house and he's growing up and he is considering, that he is going to go live by himself, and he's looking forward to that. Most teenagers, most of them, not all of them, but usually if a person has a mature growth, at a certain point, they want to live by themselves. Now, if a teenager would ask the parents, is the life as an adult going to be easier than the life as a child? What would you say? Well, not really. Now you are on your own, you have to work, you have responsibilities, you will have a family probably where you have to take care of them, you won't have your parents there to give you everything. Actually, life will be tougher, will be more difficult, will have a lot of challenges that you didn't have up to now. So why would this teenager want to become an adult? Just because he's mature to do that. That person cannot go back. It's not that that person wants to become an adult because life will be easier. It's just the natural thing to do. It doesn't matter if it will be harder or not, because the fulfillment as a person that you can go through, it's part of what we have to the path that we have to walk. So nobody becomes an adult because somebody is telling him, oh, life will be so easy, will be so nice, you will be able to get everything you want. With the spiritual life, it's something like that. A person takes on the spiritual life seriously, really, because it's mature to do that. Because there is a point in the evolution of his consciousness or her consciousness where there is no choice. This is what we have to do. And in the same way that if a teenager stays home until he's 30, 40, in the same way that that is something unhealthy in most cases, if a person is ready for the spiritual path and doesn't take the spiritual path, it will be unhealthy also for that person. So it's not a question of choice. When a person tries to take the spiritual path because of promises that finds, in books that are geared toward being sold and the author getting money from that. When the person takes on the spiritual path for those reasons, usually the experience is not a good one. But if the person is mature and is sincere, there will be many challenges in the spiritual life. But with each step, there is an expansion of consciousness, an expansion of the way we experience life, an expansion of understanding, which is worthwhile. It's not that there won't be suffering. On the contrary, as we are going to see, we begin to see more, we begin to realize more, we begin to be more sensitive. So a person, that phrase that says, ignorance is bliss. A person that is dull is protected from suffering. The more sensitive you become, suffering is more vivid for you. But at the same time, your understanding is deeper, your possibility of, your level of experience of life is so much richer, that is part of, it's not that one thing is better than the other. It's just a different way of living. And it's something that really brings a meaning and a purpose to our lives. If we are really at the point where we begin to realize that the material life, so to say, it's not, I don't want to demonize the material life as against the spiritual life, but just to talk in quick terms, if we realize that the material life is not enough, and we start feeling this sense of lack, this sense of unfulfillment, and even if we get a bigger car, a bigger house, more, and we start to realize that this is not really making us happier, when we change gradually our life and we change our aims, our views, then this sense of fulfillment begin to be born in our hearts. So it doesn't matter if life will be more complicated or not. The sense of the need for fulfillment is one of the powerful, motors, let's say, in our life. Yeah, at some point, desire is what pushes us to grow, to achieve, to try to get things. At certain point in our evolution, it is this need for a subtler fulfillment. It's this aspiration. And at certain point, we are going to transcend even this need for fulfillment. And these are all stages on the path. So the Voice of the Silence talks about all this. The Voice of the Silence gives us also some very interesting hints about the spiritual life. It is more of an inspirational book than a philosophical book. Although it's very deep, and many times to understand one aphorism that is there, we need to talk a whole hour. The purpose is not to explain a philosophy, but to inspire, or to give some seeds for meditation, to give some, as Blavatsky said, this is a book that is meant for people who are already on a spiritual path. That doesn't mean that we cannot profit from it. What I mean is that this book is not explaining the basics. It takes for granted that the person is serious, that the person is earnest. And so we have to, when we read this, we have to take that into account. Now, even if some things in the book may be beyond what we think we can attain right now, it is always very useful to have a clear view of the aim of the spiritual life, because we know more or less where we are heading. Even if we cannot follow exactly the things that the book is describing, we know in what direction we should move. So we have to read these books with no ambition of, attaining what the book is talking about. We have to be humble and say, I am what I am, and my purpose is to take the next step forward. It doesn't mean how far I am from the goal, which we never can know. But if we read these books with ambition, then we become frustrated because we are not there, or we feel that we are not doing the things right, or that we may feel guilt, or that we are not good enough. All these feelings that unfortunately are associated with the religious life, at least in the West. I don't know how this is in the East. So let us take this book as a signpost on the path, and I think it will be something very inspiring for all of us. So that's more or less what I wanted to share as a way of introduction. You can get the book in the library, or, well, this book has been, published since 1889, never ran out of print, went out of print. So you can find it very easily anywhere. And when you read it, as I said, you probably won't be able to understand everything that is said, but to generate a state by reading it. Don't try to understand everything. And I will try to explain, the main topics and the main aphorisms, so that may help assist you in your study and practice of what this book says. So now we can, as usual, we can open for questions, comments.
Pablo, would you be willing to just read an excerpt from it, just to give us a taste, a flavor of what the book is like?
Okay. The first fragment, which is called The Voice of the Silence, says, "These instructions are for those ignorant of the dangers of the lower idis." Idis are psychic powers. "He who would hear the voice of the silence, the soundless sound, and comprehend it, has first to learn the nature of concentration, dharana. Having become indifferent to the objects of perception, the pupil must seek out the king of the senses, the thought producer, the one who awakes the illusion. The mind is the great slayer of the real. Let the disciple slay the slayer." That's the opening, for example, of the first fragment, which is basically saying the voice of the silence, nada in Sanskrit, which is like, if we want to put it in this way, the voice of our real self, can be heard only when the mind is in silence. This is not different from what the Christian mystics constantly say. For example, Toller, who was a disciple of Meister Eckhart, he said, if you want to listen to God, you have to keep quiet. If you speak, God will keep quiet. So the idea is that we have to silence our mind in order to be able to hear the voice of God in this sense. And Blavatsky says that to be able to do that, it's not that you can do it just by repeating a mantra or trying to silence the mind in an artificial way. Those things may be useful, in your practice, but basically you have to find the king of the senses, which is the mind, the thought producer, the origin of your thoughts, and slay or transcend or destroy the cause of thinking. Of course, this is in a mystical way. We need to think for our daily life. But during meditation, we have to be able to go beyond thoughts. So, for example, that's how the first fragment opens. The second fragment, once the person is able to do all that, it says, "And now, O teacher of compassion, point thou the way to other men. Behold, all those who, knocking for admission, await in ignorance and darkness to see the gate of the sweet law flung open." And the candidates say, "Shalt not thou, Master of thine own mercy, reveal the doctrine of the heart? Shalt thou refuse to lead thy servants unto the path of liberation?" So this is, now that you are a master, what are you going to do? Are you going to help us or just, go away into? And the third, so these are the two paths. And the third fragment begins by saying that the disciple that is now an enlightened person says to his master, the choice is made, I thirst for wisdom. Oh no, this is where the continuity doesn't follow. This is now a disciple that is willing to follow the path and says, Master, the choice is made, I thirst for wisdom. Now hast thou rent the veil before the secret path and taught the greater doctrine. Thy servant here is ready for thy guidance. So now the path of initiation will be taught. It's in a very poetic and beautiful language.
Something to just be grasped from within somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions?
Hello, Pablo. I just wanted to thank you for speaking. I thought it was excellent. I had a couple of questions. First, I'd like to ask samsara. You mentioned samsara in the second fragment, I believe. This word samsara, is it a Hindu text? Is it a Buddhist word? I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No. Samsara is a Hindu word that is also used in Buddhist texts, the same as nirvana. Nirvana, it was being used in Hinduism, but they don't use it as much as Buddhists. And samsara means illusion in a sense. You know, it has many meanings according to the school, the philosophical school. But basically is the life where you don't know who you really are and you don't know what reality is. So we live limited by our bodily perception, we live limited by our mental constructs, so the life in the world of illusion.
Also, I wanted to ask about the Book of the Golden Precepts. You said that there were 39 verses, and the Voice of the Silence was just the initial 3, or I don't know what the order was. Perhaps she just took, I don't know.
No, we don't know. There are 90 treatises. Blavatsky knew by heart 39 and had notes about the others. And she translated only 3 in the Voice of the Silence. We don't know why she chose those and the order. I don't think they have any order because many of the treatises are like recordings of lectures or talks by Arya Sangha, who is the founder of this school of Yogacara. And some of them, as I said, are pre-Buddhist. So I don't think they have any particular order. She just picked those 3. She probably thought that those are the ones that were more relevant. And they are, because one is about meditation, the other is about the bodhisattva ideal, which is central to Theosophy also. And the third one is about the path of initiation, which is also very central to Theosophy. So these 3 books are talking about elements that are very important in the Theosophical view. So maybe that was the reason why she chose them.
Can I have permission to ask you one more question? I know you mentioned the Bodhisattva briefly. Could you tell me aspects that one could, or where one could look? I don't mean to put you on the spot. I don't know. This was about Voice of the Silence. It was not about the Bodhisattva. What are aspects that we could look towards becoming more like the Bodhisattva, or?
Yeah, we are going to talk about that when dealing with the second fragment. And also, within the Theosophical tradition, whatever you read about the path of discipleship, or the path of initiation, or the Mahatmas, or Masters of the Wisdom, that's the Theosophical take on the Bodhisattva ideal. In Buddhism, you can read texts from the Mahayana tradition, especially from Tibetan Buddhism, because, as I said, these 2 schools, Madhyamaka and Yogacarya, are not very active. But you can find information about the Buddhist point of view on the Bodhisattva ideal in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk very much.